Chilling tales for dark nights.
The Conversion. Written by Daniel Cornell. Performed by Jesse Cornett. Featuring John Evans and Brindolyn McNair. I sprang out of bed as the alarm rang at the crack of dawn. I could hear the church bells ringing outside the rectory. It was time to celebrate morning mass at Our Lady of the Rosary parish on a cold, rainy morning in Baltimore. It was November 2nd, All Souls Day, and I had a busy day ahead of me. After hustling over to the church, I put on my priestly vestments and proceeded to say mass without a hitch. I always prayed the Mass in Latin. My congregation was very traditional and cherished the Latin prayers. They were delighted to have a young pastor who loved Latin as much as them. I changed into my black cassock after Mass and went into the front pew to say my morning prayers. Many priests in the modern age like to wear normal street attire when out in the secular world, but I always preferred wearing my ankle-length cassock. How would people know I was a priest if I didn't wear my cassock? It was my uniform. My prayer book, rosary, and large pectoral cross were always with me during morning prayer. I loved praying in the pews of the church. Our Lady of the Rosary parish was a large Baroque church, with uniform lighting from the many stained glass windows surrounding the north and south walls of the church. The large-scale ceiling frescoes made it a truly awe-inspiring house of God. Many parishioners enjoyed staying after Mass to admire the marble statues and icons that ornamented the side altars of the church. Usually people kept to themselves and did not bother anyone, and nobody dared to interrupt me during my morning prayers. On this particular morning, Mrs. Basso, a longtime parishioner, scooted into the pew next to me.
Happy All Souls Day, Father Stephen,
she shouted, with a grin from ear to ear. Mrs. Basso always sported her giant red hat in church. She was not an aficionado of the chapel veil like many of our other parishioners, as it was too subtle for her personality. She was a boisterous Italian woman, about 50 years old. She was a sweet lady, but lacked the self-awareness to filter her thoughts before speaking.
That was a wonderful sermon on purgatory. I hope I'm lucky enough to punch my ticket straight to heaven. Purgatory does not sound like a place I want to visit,
she continued. Mrs. Basso did not seem to notice or care that I was trying to concentrate on praying my rosary. "Hello, Mrs. Basso," I calmly replied, while shifting my attention to the animated Italian woman. "I'm glad you enjoyed the sermon today. All Souls Day is my favorite feast day. And we should always keep death, judgment, heaven, and hell in mind. That's all that matters in the end. Is there something I can help you with?"
Well, I do have a small favor. You know my brother Bartholomew, right?
You mean your brother the Satanist? I could feel my palms getting sweaty. Mrs. Basso had mentioned her brother from time to time. This was the only thing I could remember about him. It was a detail that was hard to forget.
Former Satanist. My brother gave that stuff up a long time ago. He's had a major conversion, Father.
Mrs. Basso stared at me with those piercing dark eyes. I detected that she was trying to get to the point. "Well, that's wonderful news, Mrs. Basso, but what exactly is the favor you're asking of me?"
My brother wants to enter seminary for the Diocese of Baltimore and needs a letter of recommendation. Nobody that I've talked to seems willing to provide a recommendation due to his history.
She almost seemed ashamed and desperate. I knew as she was inferring. You mean you want me to provide a recommendation for him? I don't even know him. Plus, how do I know that this so-called conversion is authentic? I realized I had raised my voice to the level of Mrs. Basso. A few disgruntled parishioners praying nearby shot me an admonishing glare.
He wants to meet with you today. Since it is All Souls' Day, Bartholomew told me he will be visiting the cemetery to spring a soul from purgatory. You could meet him there.
Mrs. Basso was referring to the ancient Catholic devotion of prayer for souls on All Souls' Day, to release them from purgatory. The prayers were required to be performed in a cemetery. Good man. Glad to hear that he is willing to embrace this often neglected practice of the church. Maybe this conversation was real, I wondered. Could a satanic priest really have a dramatic change of heart? Conversion and repentance are cornerstones of the church's teaching, so I suppose anything is possible. Plus, who was I to judge? I would love to meet with him, Mrs. Basso, but I have a full schedule today.
Don't worry about that, Father. I spoke to my brother yesterday, and he can meet with you this evening in the cemetery after your other appointments for the day. Would you mind, Father?
I hesitated one last time, with my hand on my chin. Okay, Mrs. Basso. Tell your brother to meet me at the cemetery at 9 p.m. sharp. I'll be there.
Thank you, Father.
That night, I walked to the cemetery, which was only a few blocks from the rectory. The street was foggy from the rain earlier in the day. There were only a few street lights between the rectory and cemetery, and most everyone in the neighborhood went to bed early. There was no illumination coming from the houses on the block. I don't know what creeped me out more, meeting a former satanic priest in a graveyard, or walking alone in this murky, abandoned neighborhood. When I arrived at the cemetery, I observed a dark, shadowy figure about 40 yards past the gate hovering over a tombstone. The lack of streetlights surrounding the cemetery made it difficult to determine what the figure was, but I could spot 2 small embers of light near the figure. The embers looked like glowing red eyes staring at me. Could this be Bartholomew? The person didn't seem to notice me as I slowly approached, but as I got closer, I realized that the glowing embers were lanterns. The person was holding one lantern and the other was resting on top of the tombstone, lighting up the engravings. I didn't shout to get the person's attention. I did not want to disturb the neighborhood, so I kept moving in closer and closer. When I was 10 paces away, I could decipher the outline of a man in a black suit and tie. I wasn't sure if he was wearing his Sunday best to impress me or to show respect for the person 6 feet under the tombstone he was near. He looked up at me with piercing dark eyes, much resembling his sister's. "Mr. Basso?" I cautiously inquired. A slight smirk emerged on his lips.
"Call me Bartholomew. Father Stephen, I presume?"
He responded with a thick Italian accent. Bartholomew was balding and wore a thick black beard with a touch of gray. He appeared to be in his mid-40s and was short in stature. "That's right." I wasted no time by proceeding to recap my brief discussion with his sister that morning. Although I knew of Bartholomew's life as a satanic priest, I was intrigued to learn more. If he wanted to pursue the Catholic priesthood, he would have to be open and honest with me. I cut to the chase. "Tell me about your former way of life, Bartholomew. What were you involved in exactly? I need to know the state of your soul and know that you have fully repented before I can even consider a recommendation to the priesthood. It's not every day that we have a former Satanist converting to the faith, let alone trying to become a priest." I didn't mince words. I had confidence that my forthrightness would not offend Bartholomew. If he was truly considering the priesthood as Mrs. Basso said, he would need to accept the reality of his evil ways and repent. The grin on Bartholomew's lips faded into a look of remorse. He slowly paced back and forth, with his hands behind his back. He opened up to me as I had hoped.
I was baptized and raised in the church from my youth. However, my rebellious teenage years propelled me in another direction. I was a party animal, a drunkard, a sinner. I always believed in God despite it all. It wasn't that I became an atheist. Rather, I hated God.
I could have heard a pin drop at that moment. As he spilled out his life story to me, I could sense that the memories of hating God were painful to relive. He let out a sigh and continued.
The church was constantly speaking out against spiritualism and occultism. To further my rebellion against the church, I dabbled in witchcraft and conjuring of spirits. I was eventually ordained a high priest in the Church of Satan and performed black masses.
What did that consist of? I intervened shakily. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the answer.
Various composite rituals, the rites of Lucifer, Bel, Astaroth, and the whole cohort of Infernus. My altar was decorated with every symbol of occultism imaginable, as an abomination to God. Decorating the altar required me to gain certain items.
I could now feel the perspiration dripping off my nose, and my heart was beating in my neck. What do you mean? What kinds of items, and where did you acquire them? Bartholomew's look of remorse shifted noticeably, into what appeared to be a smirk. I was now beginning to wonder if he was enjoying recounting the past.
Well, most of the items needed for these ceremonies were easy to obtain from religious stores. Crosses, chalices, and artwork. I would simply desecrate them through acts of...
Please! I get the point. I could only imagine what sort of reprehensible acts were performed on these blessed objects. I thought I could handle this story, but the details were starting to make me queasy. You can spare me those details. What other types of things did you acquire for black masses? Bartholomew opened his mouth to reply, but then hesitated. I inferred that he was trying to find the most delicate way to say it.
Bones. I needed bones. Not just any kind of bones. Human skulls.
I wasn't sure how to respond. A couple seconds passed by in silence, but it seemed like an eternity. He was waiting for me to make the next move. You mean you dug them up from graves?
No,
he replied in a low whisper.
Human sacrifice was a requirement to fulfill the Black Mass. Many pagan cultures engaged in human sacrifice. The Aztecs, for instance. This was no different.
Were the people sacrificed fellow Satanists who willingly offered themselves? I inquired. I was begging God for this to be the case. I was not in the mood to deal with the alternative.
No. If I could only turn back the hands of time, Father Stephen, if I could undo what was done.
I noticed a tear beginning to stream down his face, which froze on his cheek on this cold night.
You have to believe me, Father. I never wanted this to happen. That is why I insisted on meeting you in the cemetery at night. I didn't want anyone to overhear our conversation. I want to begin a brand new life. I want to become a Catholic priest and offer the holy sacrifice of priesthood to the one true God. Perhaps this will atone for the evil sacrifices that I offered to Lucifer.
I believed him. His sincerity seemed genuine. What is to stop me from telling this to the police?
Consider this my confession, Father.
I see. I pondered for a moment what to do next. I took a deep breath and continued. I will have to pray about this, Bartholomew. I can tell you have deep remorse for your former way of life. I don't have any doubt that your confession and conversion is sincere. However, the priesthood? The priesthood is a lifelong vow that the church takes seriously. You must realize that if I write a letter of recommendation for you, it will take 6 years of training in seminary, learning philosophy and theology. You understand what you're getting yourself into, don't you?
Yes, Father. I understand the commitment.
I will pray about it and let you know by tomorrow. At that moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an object that looked like a cross.
I want to give you something. Take it.
He placed the object in the palm of my hand and squeezed my fingers shut.
Regardless of your decision, I want you to have this as a gift. Please say you will accept it.
I pulled my hand from his grip and opened my fingers to examine the object. It was a silver cross with red rubies and green sapphires along the border in an alternating pattern. I looked up at Bartholomew and smiled. Thank you. This was unnecessary.
No, I insist.
Before either of us could say another word, I heard a loud creaking noise. It sounded like a gate swinging open. I looked over Bartholomew's shoulder and spotted a dark shadow coming in through the gate on the opposite end of the cemetery from where I entered. He, or she, was briskly walking towards us without saying a word. Was I being trapped as another one of Bartholomew's sacrifices? Was this his accomplice coming to help subdue me? Was Bartholomew just buying time with his story until his friend could arrive? Surely not. I felt ashamed for thinking such a thing. The human mind tends to dream up the worst possible outcome when confronted with the unexpected. As the figure approached the light from the 2 lanterns, I realized it was his sister.
Hello, gentlemen. Did you two have a nice chat?
We did, sis. And you don't need to be a snoop about it.
I was grateful that he responded before I could. Her blunt entrance gave me the impression that she was expecting a final resolution to Bartholomew's request for a letter of recommendation. Patience isn't a virtue that modern humans are endowed with. Now, the 3 of us walked out of the graveyard together, and then Bartholomew and his sister parted in the opposite direction after a cordial farewell. I went back to the rectory and sank into my favorite armchair in my study. I glanced up and admired my vast collection of books on the wall. They were mostly liturgical books on how to pray Mass. Traditional Catholics like myself have an affection for good liturgical worship. I put Bartholomew's cross on the end table, lit a pipe, and closed my eyes for exhaustion. It was almost 11 p.m. at this point, and I was very tired from a long day. I knew I should go to bed as I had another busy day ahead of me, but my mind was racing from today's events. I promised Bartholomew I would pray about writing his letter of recommendation, I thought. Perhaps some scripture reading before prayer will inspire me in the right direction. I grabbed my Bible off the end table and cracked it open to a random page in the middle. I then closed my eyes and proceeded to point at a random verse to see if that would provide any wisdom. I knew this was not a scientific way to gain inspiration and was probably a superstitious approach to the scriptures. But I figured it couldn't be worse than Bartholomew's sins. I once again felt ashamed for such a thought. Who was I to judge? I opened my eyes and read the verse. As a dog that returneth to his vomit, so is the fool that repeateth his folly. Proverbs 26:11. I laughed and closed my Bible. Perhaps this was a sign that the priesthood was not such a good idea for Bartholomew. How could I be sure that he would not return to his former satanic ways? If he did return to occultism, he would have access to many blessed objects as a Catholic priest, and could use them for acts of desecration. Could easy access to blessed objects be part of his motive? As the night drifted on, I felt myself falling in and out of sleep as I mulled over these horrible thoughts. My eyes slowly opened to the morning light squeaking in through the shades. I was lying flat on my back as I stretched and let out a big yawn. I didn't remember going to bed. My last memory was sitting in my study pondering the ironic Bible verse that I pointed to. That's when the realization hit me, and I jumped out of bed in a panic.
What is this? Where am I? This isn't my house. This isn't my room.
My heart was beating 100 miles per hour, and I was getting lightheaded. I was having a full-blown panic attack. I didn't recognize this room. The only thing I recognized was the silver cross, ornamented with red rubies and green sapphires on the pillow where my head was.
What am I wearing? These aren't my pajamas.
I saw a bathroom door open down the hall from where I was lying. I ran to it and looked straight into the mirror. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. Dark, piercing eyes stared back at me. I was staring into the face of Bartholomew Basso. Was I dreaming? I reached up and touched my face, expecting my finger to go through it like it was a phantom. My finger stopped as it bumped into the flesh of a cheek.
This is real. I am not dreaming.
I then heard sirens outside my window. It was a police car. 2 officers stepped out and were heading for the front door. One of the officers began pounding on the door with his nightstick.
Bartholomew Basso, you're under arrest!
I walked to the door in a daze. I was still lightheaded and was not thinking clearly. I simply obeyed the officer's demand and opened the door.
Bartholomew Basso, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will get down. Held against
The officer handcuffed me and read me my rights. I was in the back of a police car before I could muster up anything to say to the officers. I was arrested for the murder of 3 people. Their decaying remains were found in the crawl space of Bartholomew's house. The bodies were recovered, except for the skulls. Police said that a tape recorder was left at the police headquarters with a confession to the murders and information on the whereabouts of the 3 missing persons. The voice on the recorder was Bartholomew Basso's. The confession had been recorded the day before my arrest. An anonymous tipper called from a payphone the morning of my apprehension and said that the confession was secretly taped during a private conversation with Bartholomew. He had it all planned out. I went through months of psychiatric therapy. The many psychiatrists that I visited dismissed my absurd claim that I was Father Stephen of Our Lady of the Rosary Parish, trapped inside the body of Bartholomew Basso. The countless facts that I knew about Father Stephen did not impress them. A good stalker could come up with those facts. I was told by several people that Father Stephen still lived in the rectory at the parish and was doing well. Father Stephen did not heed my request for a visit at the psych ward. I was fit to stand trial. A few psychiatrists testified as expert witnesses and demonstrated to the jury that I had no true symptoms of schizophrenia or delusion. In their expert opinions, I was simply making up crazy stories to sound insane.
The jury find the defendant guilty on all charges.
My insanity plea did not succeed. I was sentenced to death by electric chair. I never figured out how Bartholomew pulled it off. The only thing I did know was that the Silver Cross had something to do with it. While I waited on death row, I visited the prison library every day, looking for the exact ritual that Bartholomew had performed. I never found it. The day finally arrived for my execution. They asked me what I wanted for my last meal.
Anything but Italian,
I replied. The warden visited my cell 1 hour before the execution and asked if I wanted to see a priest for last rites. The warden knew I was a religious man. The guards told him that I prayed in my cell every night. The warden stepped aside, and a man dressed in priestly robes, with a large pectoral cross around his neck, emerged from behind the door and came forward. The prison door was open, and the priest asked for privacy. The warden and the guards left. The priest sat on a chair across from me and looked at my face. He had an expression of remorse when he entered my prison cell. But when the warden and guards departed, his lips slowly transformed into a familiar smirk. Only now, it was on a different face. We talked in private for several minutes. Bartholomew remained firm in his conviction that he had truly converted from his satanic ways. That didn't change the fact that he had 3 bodies in his crawl space that needed to be dealt with. He no longer needed the letter of recommendation. He bypassed the 6 years required of seminary training and picked up on the liturgical ceremonies on the Catholic priesthood in no time. Perhaps the years he'd spent mocking the faith had trained him indirectly. My study at the rectory was also equipped with dozens of liturgical books to learn from. My conversation with the priest was abruptly interrupted.
Dead man, walking!
I heard a guard yell down the hallway. The hour had passed quickly. The prison cell opened, and the priest gave me a final blessing.
Jinnu by Meagan J. Meehan. Performed by Ashley Tolfo. The estate was opulent, a palace among mere mansions. Yet to Chelsea Blackbourne, it was a miserable prison of boredom and routine. Grand, yet familiar, and familiarity bred contempt. The manor was evidence of the great wealth and privilege that had once belonged to the Blackbourne family, a lifestyle Chelsea had never known. It had been nearly a century since the clan had been truly prominent. Even Chelsea's father had not experienced the majestic heyday of the family legacy. Unlike their ancestors, they had never been invited to balls or galas. They existed in the shadows of excess, devoid of the pleasures of extravagance that the house portrayed. It had high ceilings and winding staircases, thick stone walls and grand fireplaces, dozens of rooms and quarters for servants, spaces that were now empty. The manor's decor was aging, yet lavish, which enabled the house to maintain its dignity despite its present owner's problematic financial circumstances. Chelsea roamed the halls, covered by lush Persian carpets and lit by glass chandeliers that glowed golden. There were dozens of oil paintings, mostly portraits of well-dressed and long-dead relatives, and intricately carved wooden furniture that would last for centuries. There had once been considerable quantities of jewelry, silverware, and porcelain, but the majority had been sold over the past 50 years. Now all the remaining treasures were in the attic, a place Chelsea was barred from, but infiltrated whenever she could. Chelsea's father, Henry, inherited the mansion and the acres of land it stood upon from his Uncle George. George, an eccentric bachelor, had lived his life in the lap of luxury and spent his fortune traveling to far-off locations like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where he had amassed various artifacts. Uncle George, a private person, built a huge stone wall around the grounds and ensured that there was only one entrance into the premises, which was guarded by a wrought iron gate painted the darkest shade of black. Throughout his life, he embarked on his own adventures and shirked all traditional roles. Chelsea had never met her Uncle George. He died before her parents were married, but she assumed that he had been completely bonkers. To his credit, he hadn't been responsible for any of the terrible investments that had ultimately bankrupted the Blackbournes. In fact, Uncle George had been quite the businessman. He created a business out of his assorted oddities collection by opening and operating an antique shop in the city's downtown. Of course, most downtown dwellers couldn't afford to buy anything, so George changed tactics. He turned the shop into a curiosities museum and charged the public admission to enter. When George passed away, he had left all his worldly goods to his favorite nephew, Henry. Henry had been cared for by George since the age of 16, after his father committed suicide, and his mother had a nervous breakdown. Insanity, Chelsea noted, plagued all the Blackbourne women. Even her mother Agatha, who had married into the family, hadn't been quite right. Apparently, mental instability attracted Blackbourne men. Motherhood hadn't suited Agatha. The scarce memories Chelsea had of her were not fond ones. When Chelsea was 3, Agatha had fallen off the roof, to her death. At least, that was what Henry said. Now older and wiser at age 11, Chelsea strongly suspected that her mother had purposefully thrown herself down, wishing to die. Agatha's death had turned Henry cold and standoffish. Chelsea, meanwhile, hadn't been dismayed. They hadn't liked each other, and so she had no reason to mourn her mother's passing. Since then, Chelsea spent her days confined to the house or languishing in its sizable gardens, as her father locked himself in the study. Her only company was her tutor, Miss Iverson, and Sarah, the wretched maid. Chelsea utterly disliked dowdy old Miss Iverson, who constantly pestered her to polish her pianist skills, but she outright hated beautiful, perfect Sarah. While Miss Iverson was only the latest in a string of tutors, few lasted long with Chelsea. Sarah had been a near constant presence and enemy for over 4 years. Sarah worked at the estate 3 days a week, and as much as Chelsea tried to ignore her, there was something about the servant that captivated and enraged her. Sarah was 19, and much prettier than Chelsea, which seemed woefully unjust considering that she was also much poorer than Chelsea. In spite of how far the Blackborns had fallen in high society circles, they were still undeniably privileged. Utterly unlike Sarah, who toiled away as a maid for 3 different households 6 days a week. Once, Chelsea asked where she lived, and the maid confessed to residing in a small row house, cramped with several younger siblings and a sickly mother. Sarah was a pitiful creature burdened with a difficult life. The sole advantage she held over Chelsea was her looks. Sarah was undeniably beautiful, and Chelsea was indescribably jealous. Chelsea had first noticed her unfortunate features at age 10. Prior to that, she hadn't thought much about her pudgy belly, frizzy hair, and buck teeth. She rarely registered her broad nose, too far apart eyes, and dull brown hair, until one day she looked in the mirror and realized that she didn't look anything like the fairies illustrated in her storybooks. Fairies were dainty and delicate. Stubby Chelsea resembled the depictions of witches. Sarah, however, was tall and slim, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the incarnation of loveliness. One day, Chelsea had been in town with her father on a rare outing to the curiosity shop and heard a group of young men whistling and shouting. Several stable boys were desperately vying for the attention of Sarah as she hurried down the street, wicker basket in hand, obviously on an errand. The sight had filled Chelsea with envy. She knew she was too young to be courted, but one day she would be expected to marry. But how was she to marry when she didn't look like Sarah? Moreover, why should some common Sarah be graced with good looks when she, a Blackborn, was not? It was simply unacceptable. Sarah hadn't as much as glanced in the boy's direction. Clearly, such attention was too common an occurrence to warrant a reaction. Chelsea had never been fond of Sarah, but her indifference turned to loathing after witnessing that scene. She vowed to punish Sarah for her blessed features and tormented her every chance she got. She switched the labels on the salt and pepper shakers. She threw mud on newly washed sheets as they dried on the line. She hid the broom and misplaced the kettle, and when questioned, denied everything. Sarah started avoiding Chelsea, a fact that elated the younger girl and filled her with an intoxicating sense of power. Chelsea felt a similar sense of accomplishment every time she frightened off a tutor. She disliked learning and threw wild tantrums whenever anyone tried to make her sit for a lesson. Her father did nothing to quell her, and the tutors dared not strike her. She was still a Blackborn, after all. So they simply left to find greener pastures, or at least more agreeable students. The same thing happened with the nannies. From age 3 to 7, Chelsea had been burdened with several minders whom she successfully sparred with until her father finally stopped hiring them. Miss Iverson was the sole teacher she hadn't managed to banish. The elderly spinster Miss Iverson always looked after Chelsea whenever her father had an appointment. Henry rarely took Chelsea along with him since she acted up relentlessly and had a tendency to make a spectacle of herself at formal events. Chelsea didn't mind staying in Miss Iverson's care since she had diligently studied plants and herbs and knew precisely how to spike the old woman's tea and make her fall into a long, deep slumber. Whenever Miss Iverson drifted off to sleep, Chelsea seized the opportunity to ascend into the attic. She had even taught herself how to pick locks solely for the purpose of exploring it. Chelsea was inexplicably enticed by the attic. It was as if something inside of it called out to her incessantly. She liked its dim light and its musty smell. She liked the sight of cobwebs and dust. Mostly, she was fascinated by the masses of objects stacked on top of each other, all things from Uncle George's collection that had not been selected for display at the curiosity shop. Chelsea thought deeply about the treasures. Who were the original owners? How had Uncle George come to possess them? Unanswerable questions, of course, but also divine food for thought. Time drifted idly as she wandered aimlessly among ancient armor and dulled swords, fierce-looking carved masks and oddly fleshy objects in jars filled with yellowed liquids. Chelsea was especially fond of the jars which contained half-formed pigs and eels and cows. One jar even looked as if it held a human baby, although she couldn't imagine how a baby could have possibly ended up in a bottle. She had been rummaging through the attic looking for more jars, or, better yet, papers confirming what they were and where they were from, when she stumbled across the trunk. It was medium-sized, upholstered with aging brown leather, fastened with brass-buckled-like locks. It was an unremarkable thing that Chelsea would normally cast aside without a second glance. But something about the trunk pulled her toward it magnetically. She crept closer, unable to take her eyes off it. On a whim, she reached out and touched the lid. As soon as her palm connected with its surface, an odd, dizzying feeling came over her, as if she was being lifted out of her body, while another presence entered her head. Chelsea was aware that the voice was in her mind, but somehow it also seemed to be emanating from inside the trunk. Her sudden intense urge to carry the trunk down 3 flights of stairs and into the garden seemed ludicrous considering that it was nearly as big as she was. Yet, apparently, the chest was lightweight, because the next thing Chelsea knew, she was sitting on the garden's lush, overgrown grass, under her beloved hemlock trees, fiddling with the trunk's locks. Strangely, she had no memory of actually carrying it downstairs, or of leaving the attic. The final lock came undone with a snap, and Chelsea eagerly lifted the lid. She was instantly overcome by a thick, grayish-white cloud. At first she thought it was dust or smoke, but it had a strangely intoxicating aroma that was both timeless and exotic. It was like no other scent she had ever known. Then, with a sound somewhere between a gasp and a yawn, a lithe creature arose from the confines of the trunk. Its body was white, yet vapid, like a ghost, although it better resembled an insect than a human. It had long, spindly limbs, arms, legs, fingers, and large black eyes. Its nose was non-existent, its mouth merely a small, straight line near the bottom of its oval head. It had no hair or clothes. Its gender was indeterminable. Chelsea stumbled backwards, but excitement quickly overcame her initial fear. She had read books about these creatures before, and although they traditionally emerged from sealed, fancy bottles, it could only be one thing: a genie. "You've got to grant me 3 wishes," Chelsea shouted at the creature. "I am entitled to 3 wishes." The creature cocked its head to the side, examining her. "I said," Chelsea continued, but then the being spoke.
"I heard you, small one. But I do not understand why you want only 3 wishes. You could have so much more."
Chelsea's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she inquired. The creature stretched.
"You freed me. I've been in there for ages. I must show my gratitude.
Good. I want a new music box. A gold one, inlaid with diamonds and pearls.
But that's not what you truly desire. Now is it?
The creature challenged. Of course it is, Chelsea spat. I wouldn't have asked for it otherwise.
Material things may be pretty, but getting your way is so much more satisfying. Don't you think?
Crooned the creature.
I specialize in fate. If you want something to happen, I can assist you.
Chelsea stared at the creature wordlessly, intrigued.
If you let me live in your lush garden, I can help you with all your problems,
the creature explained.
My advice is golden, and my magic is potent. I can help you with all that ails you, but my presence must be our secret. You wouldn't want to share my attentions, now would you?
Chelsea vigorously shook her head.
My remaining request is that you bring me food, preferably meat. I don't eat much, but when I'm hungry, I'm ravenous.
Chelsea skeptically considered the offer. Tell me this, she tested. How do I rid myself of my tutor? I'm tired of her, and I want my father to fire her at once. The creature's mouth twisted upwards in a sinister grin.
That's easy,
it replied.
Spread rumors about her, tarnish her supposedly pristine reputation. Tell your father that she's aging, and she is starting to disclose scandalous little secrets. Perhaps she had an affair, or two, with men, or boys, or maybe even other ladies. That wouldn't be proper at all, now would it?
Chelsea had never thought about spreading nasty untruths regarding Miss Iverson, but it could certainly work. She was aging, and did mumble on and on from time to time. Who's to say that she couldn't have confessed some dark secrets? And what about that horrid maid? Chelsea hissed. She's even worse, scurrying around, flaunting her beauty, mocking me with her existence. She must be stopped.
If you really want to punish her, take away her beauty,
the creature replied.
Scarring her face will be a fate worse than death. After all, if you make her lose one of her pretty eyes, she'll have to suffer as an invalid for years, decades, forevermore.
How do I do it? Chelsea pleaded, trembling with glee and amused by the creature's cunning ways. She already felt a strong kinship with it than with any human she had ever known.
I'll guide you,
the creature promised.
I aid those who are loyal to me. Have we a pact?
Chelsea did not hesitate to accept the creature's terms. The next thing Chelsea knew, she was back in the attic, sitting on the floor with the trunk in its original position. She didn't remember bringing it upstairs or pushing it back into place. It was as if she had done so in a trance. A sudden wave of sorrow washed over her. It was all nothing more than a daydream. Yet, when Chelsea glanced out the attic window, she was elated to see the oddly elegant creature coiling itself around the branches of the hemlock trees. A dream it was not. Within a week, Miss Iverson was fired. Henry had been horrified by his daughter's accusations of the tutor's unladylike behavior, especially when Chelsea told him about how Miss Iverson had caressed her. Needless to say, the old woman was not provided with a reference. Yet, the ultimate glory came 3 days later, when the hated Sarah was finally permanently marred. Following the creature's advice, Chelsea tightened all the piano strings and partially cut several with a kitchen knife. Then she ordered the maid to dust inside the piano. As soon as Sarah opened the cover, the steel strings popped off and slashed her face. Her screams were music to Chelsea's ears. There had been a lot of blood. Sarah's right eye was completely ruined, and the skin across most of her face was covered with deep gashes that would definitely leave lifelong marks. Sarah had spent weeks in the hospital, stitched up like a rag doll, and never returned to work. Several months after the maiming, Chelsea had spotted Sarah in town walking, with a black veil over her face to conceal her disfigurement. Young men stood on the corner, yet not one whistled, clapped, or called. Chelsea was pleased. Over time, Chelsea learned the creature's name, Jinnu, and accommodated its feeding requirements. During dinners of chicken or steak, prepared by the new housekeeper, a quiet woman who was neither beautiful nor bothersome, Chelsea saved some morsels and sneaked them out to Jinnu. Neither her father nor the new maid ever complained, which was good, since anyone who annoyed Chelsea was guaranteed to meet with misfortune. Jinnu's presence ensured that Chelsea always got whatever she wanted. After feigning trauma from the alleged assault of Miss Iverson, Chelsea convinced her father that she was educated enough for a girl of her status. Without any scheduled activities, Chelsea spent her days learning how to mix potions to rid her of pimples and to straighten her frizzy hair. Jinnu was quite satisfied in the garden. The creature nested in the darkest portion of shrubbery, hidden away among the hemlock trees and poison ivy, and built an elaborate nest by weaving silky white tendrils together, creating a web, just as spiders did. It was also eating more. When the leftover scraps were no longer enough, Chelsea started capturing birds, squirrels, rabbits, and the occasional stray cat for the creature to dine upon. The massive grounds of the Blackbourne estate were unkempt since the family no longer had the means to afford the gardeners that the property required. Due to the wild and undisturbed conditions of the land, Chelsea was utterly shocked when her father managed to catch a glimpse of Jinnu one day, several years after its arrival. Henry had been pacing around the grounds, worried about the cost of Curiosity Shop's rent. He got too near to the hemlock trees and spotted Jinnu slithering around the upper branches. Henry Blackbourne screamed and ran into the house, hysterically ranting about snakes.
God in heaven, there's a giant snake thing in the garden.
Chelsea found him in the living room, searching for his old Crimean war sword, fully intending to slay the creature in the trees. She calmed him and accompanied him back to the garden and eventually convinced him that there was nothing there. Yet, Henry remained suspicious and continued searching around the garden. So, Chelsea decided that he had to go. Chelsea fixed him tea laced with cyanide and told the doctors that he had died in his sleep.
Child.
There was no reason to be suspicious. Henry was aging, and financial stresses often weakened older men's hearts. Chelsea, being of legal age, inherited the entire estate. She felt no qualms about what she had done, since she had done it on behalf of Jinnu. After all, the creature doted on her far more than her father ever had. Once named the proprietor of the estate, Chelsea promptly sold the curiosity shop and its remaining items. She fired the housekeeper and lived like a hermit off her dwindling inheritance. She took up gardening zealously, planting additional hemlock and spindly trees, along with deadly flowers such as foxglove, ragwort, oleander, and yellow jessamine. She even started a makeshift greenhouse in an upstairs bedroom, cultivating Venus flytraps and other assorted poisonous vegetation, until the house was surrounded by a prism of colors. Sometimes it seemed like the garden was enchanted, alive. Trees whispered, petals snapped, vines coiled, and roots twisted and pulled. In her spare time, Chelsea explored Uncle George's library. He had collected books about uncommon yet fascinating subjects. Histories of wars and dead languages, medieval medical practices, instructions on potions and spells. One book regarding human escapades with supposedly mythical beings included an illustration that claimed to depict a Middle Eastern knight slaying evil jinn, dark forms of genies, somewhat akin to Jinnu. Below the artwork read the caption, "Imam Ali conquers jinn, unknown artist, 1568. Chelsea paid it no mind. Time ticked by, its rules non-applicable on the Blackbourne property. Chelsea never seemed to age a day over 30. But Jinnu grew bigger and hungrier, and unable to hunt efficiently on its own, depended on Chelsea. She started traveling to the poor side of town at night, frequenting the dingiest pubs and the shabbiest inns to prey on the rabble of society. Initially, she pretended to be a charity worker and tricked working girls, destitute widows, and hapless orphans into following her home, where Jinnu feasted upon them. Authorities never came to the estate asking questions. The poor were seldom missed. During the course of her rare interactions with other people, Chelsea came to the realization that she was no longer the plain, borderline ugly child she had once been. She subsequently learned how to use her beauty to woo men back to the estate. At first, such seductions had been risky, as only the true dregs of society, like men newly released from prison, would accept such an improper offer. However, with each additional trip into town, such propositions were met with increasing ease. Apparently, the decency of the commoners was being eroded at an astounding pace. Chelsea wasn't sure exactly how many times a year Jinnu had to eat. The creature simply got hungry when it got hungry. Gradually, Chelsea learned its meals were extremely infrequent, occurring every few years, perhaps every few decades. She supposed it was possible that a human body could fill Jinnu up for thousands of days, just as a large rat would fill a snake for months. All the clocks on the estate had long since stopped working, and time was a riddle. but indications of change abounded whenever Chelsea ventured into the village. On one trip, she would spy a newly constructed building, and on the next, the same building would be decrepit with age, as if it was still there at all. The fashions changed even more dramatically. Top coats and corsets turned into casual suits and sequined dresses, then blue jeans and poodle skirts, followed by bright, obnoxious colors that Chelsea heard referred to as tie-dye. That changed to pastels and black leather jackets worn by men and women with enormous hairstyles. Next, men paraded around in baggy pants, and women stuffed themselves into impossibly tight jeans. Chelsea was not a fan of any of these styles, but she made sure to occasionally entice a female victim back to Jinnu's lair, merely to acquire clothing in which to blend into the crowds. Yet, no matter what she wore, her outfits always seemed to be slightly dated each time she exited her estate. Another telling sign of the passing time was the gadgets that the villagers used. The days of horses and carriages had morphed into a world full of cars, radios, and loud blaring boxes called televisions. Most recently, people walked around staring at small rectangles of light that they held in their hands. Sometimes they even spoke to them. Chelsea hadn't the slightest idea what these devices actually did, but they were called phones, and most people seemed quite reliant on them. Although Chelsea shunned most technological advances, on one fairly recent trip, she acquired a brand new Bakelite radio, and she took great pleasure in dancing to the music known as jazz. Of course, every time she switched the radio on, the stations were different, as if the programming changed overnight. What was the value of one night in the mansion to the outside world? A year? A decade? A century? Chelsea couldn't say. She lived to amuse the creature. She sang and danced for it, and in return it kept her young and vital. After years of listening to Jinnu speak of the sumptuousness of human flesh, Chelsea decided to sample it, and quickly named it her favorite meat. She took to joining Jinnu in its meals, devouring everything but the bones, which she used to decorate the manor's interior. She was especially fond of human skulls. Eventually, Chelsea was forced to alter her hunting methods. The new world was full of security cameras, and it was no longer easy to quietly obtain victims. Jinnu knew exactly how to change tactics. The creature convinced Chelsea to start rumors around town about the Blackbourne estate being haunted by the spirits of mentally ill persons. It was a silly, juvenile story, but it was also the stuff of urban legends. Chelsea assumed the fictitious tale would catch on like wildfire. And she was right. Approximately 2 weeks after Chelsea's latest visit to town, which would have been as much as 2 decades in the outside world, 4 teenagers scaled the fence and stormed the garden like Vikings set on pillaging a village. It was a dark, moonless night, and the uninvited guests blindly stumbled through the tall, untamed grass, shouting and giggling and reeking of alcohol. They were all holding their phones, but technology was useless on the Blackbourne estate. The entire group cursed their blank, unresponsive screens. None of them saw Chelsea coming until it was too late. She swept down upon them like a storm, expertly dispatching all of the bodies in seconds before they could so much as scream. Jinnu and Chelsea both ate well that evening. Chelsea supposed that she would have to purchase a freezer to store excess meat, since she assumed their meals would be coming to them quite regularly in the future. She assumed wrong. Chelsea was entirely unaware of the emergence of social media, and this ignorance proved to be her downfall. 4 teenagers vanishing at the same time raised alarms throughout the village. When the police checked the missing youth's web pages, they discovered that the group had been planning a trip to the long-abandoned Blackbourne estate. Approximately 12 hours after the teens' disappearance, a police search party descended upon the mansion. Chelsea had been asleep in her bed, belly full and satisfied, when she was jolted awake by the sound of the intruders cutting through the locked wrought iron gate. She glanced out her window, saw the flashing lights, and heard several voices speaking in tense tones. Extreme fear immediately seized her. The plebeians were breaking in, perhaps intending to riot or loot. Maybe the world is at war again, Chelsea thought as she ran to the garden. Her panic was palpable as she imagined the villagers' discovery of the array of bones placed throughout her home. Jinnu was resting, hibernating, in its shroud-like cocoon, which glistened silver against the dark green branches of hemlock. In desperation, Chelsea violently shook the web. Jinnu awoke, hissing furiously. "Commoners are storming the grounds!" Chelsea wailed. "Too many for me to slay! Protect me!" For several moments, Jinnu remained still and stared at Chelsea, studying her. Finally, it beckoned her with its long, limber fingers. Chelsea had never entered the creature's nest before, but she eagerly crawled in, surprised to discover that the dwelling was warm and cozy, more like a tent than a web. Chelsea was starting to relax when Jinnu turned to face her. Its eyes were black and cold and utterly merciless.
"Our pact is resolved,"
it hissed, and promptly attached its gaping mouth to Chelsea's pale neck. Jinnu knew its survival depended on disguising itself amid the treetops and waiting for the chaos to subside. It summoned all of its energy and moved away from its silky nest, knowing full well that it would be difficult to find such cushy accommodations ever again. All of its human keepers, slaves, eventually faltered and had to be destroyed. But Chelsea had been the cleverest and longest-lasting of all its caretakers. Ironic, considering that Jinnu had initially been disappointed by how young and small she was. It had greatly underestimated the girl. That Chelsea was rotten deep within her core made her rare amongst humans, but indescribably useful to beings of Jinnu's ilk. The creature knew it would be fortunate to ever master another such host, but it also knew that it needed to start looking. As soon as the humans saw the conditions inside the manor, they were likely to have the building condemned. Remaining in the garden was simply not an option. Jinnu crept along the tree branches, staying close to the estate walls. It slithered toward the back of the garden, where the overgrown shrubbery was thickest, knowing that it could probably climb over that section of the wall, undetected if need be. Suddenly, Jinnu heard voices.
I can't imagine what they found.
That place is an enigma.
I'd love to see the garden, though. It's probably the only private property in the county with more plants than mine.
This statement piqued Jinnu's interest. The creature hailed originally from a land of sand and heat, an abhorrent environment which it had no fond memories of. It much preferred greenery and gardens. Jinnu peered over the wall and saw a man and a woman. Both were holding cameras and standing beside cars. The trunk of the man's car was ajar. As soon as they looked away from the wall, Jinnu snatched the opportunity. It hurried over the stone barrier and slunk into the invitingly dark trunk. A few minutes later, the man bid the woman goodbye, placing its camera in the trunk, and shut the lid. He was completely unaware of the presence of Jinnu, lurking in the back corner. This pleased the creature. It would wait for the man to pop open the trunk. Then they would make a deal.
Snow Angels by Andrew Harmon. Performed by Steve Gray. Part 1. It began when Tommy G decided we were going to emulate a Wiccan ritual he found in one of those old books from his attic. We were kids. Suzanne, Reggie, Tommy G. Franco, and I. Reggie and Franco were the oldest at 14, while the rest of us were all still a year younger. This adventure was the product of a string of snow days after a blizzard. Without school to keep us busy for 7 hours a day, our parents bundled us up and turned us loose on the winter world. There was a small tract of woods less than a mile from my house with a clearing you could get to if you knew where to find it. We agreed to meet there, each of us bringing a component of the ritual squirreled away somewhere in the multiple layers of our fleece and downy jackets. Suzanne brought a few candles, Reggie got his hands on a knife from his dad's workshop. I brought a can of red spray paint and Franco brought a lighter. Tommy G, the ringleader, brought the sacrifice, his pet snake, Sissy. We gathered in the clearing later that afternoon and Tommy G laid out the plan. We spray painted a 10-foot pentagram in the snow at the center of which sat an old stump. Suzanne put her candles around the base of the stump and Reggie struggled against the wind to keep them lit. At Tommy G's instructions, we all stood at the 5 points at the edge of the pentagram while he recited what he called a holy incantation. The ritual was supposed to let us see people's guardian spirits. As the biblical symbol of evil, the snake would allow us to see the otherwise invisible divines around us through its sacrifice. I can't tell you how cold that clearing felt. Sure, it was February, on the tail end of a cold snap that buried our little Midwestern town in 2 feet of snow, but the chill I felt started from the inside and gnawed its way out. I was sweating under all those layers, but my stomach felt like a block of ice. The wind whipped through the leafless trees and blew out one of the candles as Tommy G was finishing the last of the incantation. Maybe that's what went wrong, or maybe it was all a fuck-up from the start. Either way, the 5 of us marched in unison from the edges of the pentagram to the stump at the center. Tommy G pulled an Aldi's bag from somewhere out of the depths of his coat and sat it atop the stump. I could see the agitated snake writhing inside its plastic sack prison. Reggie handed over the knife and Tommy G cut Sissy free and laid her atop the frozen stump. We must have stood in silence for a solid minute, just stealing nervous glances at one another. Tommy G pinned Sissy's head to the stump. Sissy wriggled uncomfortably against the freezing wood. Finally, Reggie said that Tommy G wouldn't do it, and Tommy G responded by taking action. He pressed the knife's edge down behind Sissy's skull and smashed the blade down like he were chopping a carrot. Suzanne yelped. Sissy's decapitated body twisted and rolled itself into knots before falling limp into the snow. A stream of blood leaked down the side of the stump and stained the snow bright red. No one said anything for a while. Then Franco muttered, "Fuck," and went to dry heave in the woods. Suzanne sat down and began to cry. Reggie, Tommy G, and I just stood motionless around the stump, staring down at Sissy's head. "Is that all?" I asked. "Yeah," Tommy G said hollowly. "That's all." No one mentioned that we weren't seeing any spirits. We fled out of the pentagram and crowded together at the edge of the clearing. That ice block in my stomach had expanded into a certified glacier, and I felt like I would vomit any moment. Reggie took his father's knife back and frantically tried to rub away the blood with snow. I guess after a while, the awkward silence became too much for Franco because he wadded up a snowball in his gloves and chucked it at Reggie's back. That seemed to break the spell because in no time we were all dashing around the edge of the trees, pelting each other with snowballs and ducking away from incoming fire. Eventually, we began to laugh again and pushed the memory of the ritual out of our minds. Kids can do that somehow. A heavy snow started just as the sun was going down. We had wanted to build a snowman but didn't have the time, so we decided we'd all make snow angels in the clearing instead. We spread out in a row so that our angels would line up like chorus dancers. Tommy G lay down, then Franco, and Reggie, then Suzanne, and me at the end. We pushed the imprint of our bundled-up bodies into the snow and waved our arms and legs. Just as I was finishing up mine, a surge of fear and coldness rushed through me, made me convulse where I lay. I turned my head to say something, and woven behind the sheet of falling snow that blasted down around us, I saw the faintest outline of a human-like figure glide behind Tommy G. It was there, and then it was gone. It was nothing really, but it was definitely something. A blur in the background, a slight smudge of the world hushing by just behind Tommy G. Tommy G saw me staring and asked what my deal was. I announced that I might have seen a guardian spirit. Reggie and Franco booed and jeered. None of them wanted to bring up the botched ritual. Tommy G looked like a kicked puppy because he had just remembered that he had killed his only pet. Tears were welling up in Suzanne's eyes again. I told him I was just joking. I didn't mean any harm. Nighttime was creeping over the world, so we all packed up and hiked back home. That was on Friday. The weekend passed by, and none of the 5 of us saw each other. I woke up on Monday morning feeling surprisingly refreshed. The sun was just rising outside my window. I was nestled into the warmth of my comforter with the gentle drone of the heat moaning in the vents. It was 8:30 in the morning, and my mom had let me sleep in due to a 2-hour delay. When the school bus picked me up, all of my classmates were chatting and running amok. 5 days with no school had filled us with rambunctiousness that could not be contained. We joked and laughed and took turns talking about how we wished another blizzard would come and bury the whole school in snow. The bus was so busy and chaotic that none of us even noticed Tommy G wasn't there. In fact, I didn't notice myself until 3rd period when I sat at an empty table in English class. Tommy G sat behind me, and we'd usually spend the whole hour passing notes and dirty doodles back and forth. At lunch, I asked Franco and Reggie if they'd seen Tommy G, but no one had. He must have been homesick, the lucky bastard. The day dragged by, but eventually we all got dropped off on the corner, and Reggie, Franco, Suzanne, and I stood on the sidewalk shivering. We decided we would head over to Tommy G's place to give him a hard time about playing hooky. When we got to his house, the driveway and curb were both packed with cars. We figured his parents were having a party, but we'd stop by if only for a minute. Standing on the slick porch, we rang the doorbell and waited. After a few minutes, an older man we didn't recognize answered and asked what we wanted. His eyes were puffy behind his glasses. We told him we had come by to see Tommy G, and he ushered us into the foyer without a word. Inside, the mood was beyond solemn. People we didn't recognize were milling about and talking in whispers. "What's going on?" Reggie asked. "Well," the man said, then paused to consider his words. He removed his glasses and wiped at his eyes. "I don't know if I'm the one that should be telling you this." "Telling us what?" I asked. The man stared at us for a few seconds, then seemed to accept the burden of delivering bad news. He said, "Tommy's family was in a bad car wreck." He cast his eyes into the living room where all of the sad people were roaming about. I'm afraid to say, well," he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to have to say that, Tommy didn't survive." The 4 of us kids just stood there dumbfounded. We were waiting for something to tell us this was just a cruel joke. We hung in that surreal moment like flies encased in ice cubes. Suzanne's face scrunched up into an awful grimace. Tommy and his family were killed, the man said. How? Franco mumbled. Tommy had a bad head injury, the man said. I stared into the living room at all the people glancing over at us. Just around the corner, I heard someone say, brain hemorrhaging, under their breath. And the person they whispered it to gasped into their hand. How can I put into words how empty we all felt walking down that driveway? We took turns looking at each other with blank faces, and then tears began to stream down Suzanne's cheeks. My eyes swelled up as well, and I turned my head to wipe the tears away before they froze in the wind. None of us said a word. None of us could think of anything to say. We just split up and trudged home over the icy sidewalks. When I got to my house, I stopped and turned to gaze into the woods down the street. I couldn't stand going into my house. I knew my parents would see the pained look on my face and start asking questions. If I told them about Tommy G, I would absolutely break down. So before I had to face that, I wanted to return to the clearing. I wanted to stand in the place where I had last spoken to Tommy G, where we had thrown snowballs at each other and laughed and trounced around in the snow. The woods were dead silent. That harsh winter wind tore through the branches and whipped my cheeks beet red. I found Sissy's headless body at the edge of the clearing where Tommy G had thrown it before going home. A light dusting of snow covered its black scales. It was frozen solid. The spray-painted pentagram had faded also, and the candles were toppled over in the drift. On the opposite side of the clearing, our 5 snow angels remained, but I noticed something strange from a distance. I approached them slowly because in my mind I already knew what I had seen. As I stood over the 5 snow angels, I began to tremble uncontrollably because there, where Tommy G's head had laid, the snow was stained bright red. Part 2. Reggie took Tommy G's death the hardest. The two had been inseparable. Reggie grew up poor and in a pretty rough household, so Tommy G's place was where Reggie went to escape when his parents argued and screamed. He wasn't at school the next few days, and we understand why. That Friday night, we all met up again. Reggie, Franco, Suzanne, and me. Franco had a little clubhouse in his backyard that his father had built for him and his brothers. It was still so cold that we sat for a while in silence, watching our breath hang in the air. I wanted to tell everyone about what I had seen in the clearing. I wanted to say the words brain hemorrhaging like I had overheard at Tommy G's wake, and then show them the red snow that stained the head of Tommy G's snow angel. But I thought it was stupid. The red color might have come from anywhere. Maybe it had gotten on the hood of Tommy G's coat after he decapitated the snake, and I just hadn't noticed it when we first made the snow angels. I don't remember what we even talked about. We were preteens that had just lost a close friend. How could our young minds express what we were feeling? But I do remember when the night ended. Reggie was headed back to his apartment, the opposite direction as me and Suzanne. Maybe that's why Suzanne decided to tell me, because it was the first convenience of being alone with one of us. I saw something, Susan said out of nowhere. What do you mean? I asked. There was about a half a mile of sidewalk between us and our houses. We would have to pass the forest on the way. In the clubhouse, I saw... She was staring down at her feet as she spoke. She clamped her arms tight to her sides and drove her hands deep into her pockets. Something is all. Well, what was it? I asked. What do you think of the ritual we did, Andrew? She asked. The image of the blood-stained snow angel's head flashed in my mind. I didn't say anything. She asked, Do you think it worked? I remembered then what I had seen in the clearing that Friday, the blur of movement that wisped by behind Tommy G through the wind-driven snow. I wished desperately that memory was more vivid. Even at the time, I couldn't say I really saw a person. It was just a a hollowness in the air. Yet somehow, I recognized it as a being, something that moved with purpose. When I didn't answer, she asked again, "Did the ritual work?" "Have you seen any spirits?" I spat, sharply. I didn't want to tell her what I knew. Suzanne was touchy and prone to crying. I wasn't going to be the person that set her off. "Maybe," she said. I don't know." I stopped walking and stared at her. After a few steps, she turned and met my eyes. I asked, "What do you mean, maybe?" "Back in the clubhouse. I think I saw something," she said. "What did you see?" I asked. She shrank back a bit because I had become suddenly animated. I think between us we knew there was something not right going on. "It was nothing," she whined, but there were tears starting to form in her eyes, and I knew she wanted to say something. I whispered, "Suzanne." It was just like a shadow. Well, no, not a shadow. It wasn't dark. It was clear," she said. "Where?" I pried. "Just as we were leaving the clubhouse. You and I were still inside, and Franco was heading up to his porch, and I saw Reggie going around the side of the house. And it just flew right past him." Like steam? Or like a piece of glass?" I asked. She was beginning to tremble because she could see that I was nervous. "Yeah, like steam. It was just..." She sawed the sleeve of her jacket across her running nose. "She was hollow." "She?" I asked. A knot had worked its way up my throat. "Yeah, it's stupid. I felt like it was a woman," Suzanne said. "I went back to the clearing after we found out Tommy G died," I said. "Yeah, so?" she said. "I saw something there," I said. I turned and looked off toward the woods. The sun was beginning to set, and it was too late for us to venture off into the clearing and back before it grew dark. I must have been staring too long without saying anything because Suzanne stomped her foot on the icy pavement to get my attention. "Tell me," she demanded. "I don't want to tell you. I think I should show you," I said. "Then show me." "It's too late tonight. We can go tomorrow. Meet at my house and I'll take you out to the clearing." "Should we tell Reggie and Franco?" she asked. "They'll think we're nuts, and I don't think we should be bringing up Tommy G around Reggie right now," I said. "Just you and I." We met early that Saturday morning, and it had snowed a little overnight, and I was afraid the snow angels would be buried. Suzanne dressed light for the weather in a powder blue sweater and tight jeans. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had a blue headband that covered her ears and most of her forehead. It dawned on me for the first time that Suzanne was cute. She was the sporty type, not quite a tomboy, but not exactly a girly girl either. I wondered why I had never noticed the faint freckles that spanned the bridge of her nose. The forest was silent as we hiked towards the clearing. The trip took about 10 minutes maximum, but I recall that I never heard a single bird or squirrel the whole way there. I heard our heavy breathing, with the vapors of our exhalations billowing up into the dead branches. Now and then some snow would crash down on the ground, somewhere in the distance. But all in all, this little tract of woods seemed lifeless. Surprisingly, the clearing looked like it hadn't gotten even a dusting of snow. Sissy's headless body still lay frozen on the edge of the clearing. The blood that ran down the sides of the old stump had darkened to a sick brown hue, and the spray paint of the pentagram was still visible on the snow. I grabbed Suzanne's wrist and led her across the clearing. There laid our 5 snow angels all in a row. Tommy G's, then Reggie's, then Franco's, and Suzanne's, and my own at the end. "What is that?" Suzanne squealed. I had led her to Tommy G's snow angel, and she was staring down where Tommy G's head had laid, and it was still dyed bright red. I think... My breath shivered out between my chapped lips, and I glanced over at Suzanne's face. "I think it's blood." "Oh no," she moaned. She covered her face with her black-gloved hands. "No, no, no!" She took a step away from the snow angel with each utterance of the word. "Where did it come from? Whose blood?" "I don't know," I said. "I came here right after we left Tommy G's house on Monday, and it was here. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't bother finishing my sentence." "Do you think it has anything to do with—" Neither did she. We both turned towards the old stump and Sissy's severed head. "That's what I wanted to tell you, about the things you saw yesterday," I said. I sat down in the snow and pulled my legs up against my chest. "I saw it too." "You saw it?" "Yes, well, no," I said. "I saw one here, in the clearing. When we were making these, I jerked my head towards the 5 snow angels. It was snowing really hard and windy, and something just floated by. Suzanne and I were staring into each other's eyes. It was a serious stare, the depths of which were just sussing out between us, behind Tommy G. We both mulled it over in our heads for a few minutes. Then Suzanne walked back to Tommy G's snow angel and stared down at the red stain again. Then she began to cry, and she was trying to keep it quiet. So I pretended I didn't notice. An immense emptiness flooded my insides. It was helplessness. I felt like a balloon whose air had all been squeezed out of him by the pressing cold, and I was left sagging there atop the snow, waiting to fully deflate and be buried by the next blizzard. "What the hell is this?" Suzanne asked. It snapped me out of my trance, and I looked over. She had moved from Tommy G's snow angel and was staring down into Reggie's. I stood up and trudged my way over to her side. I couldn't figure out what I was seeing either. "It's..." Suzanne got down on one knee and pressed her fingers into Reggie's snow angel. "It's ice." She was right. A solid sheet of ice had formed inside Reggie's angel, as if someone had filled the imprint halfway with water and let it freeze overnight. We looked to our left and right. Franco, Suzanne, and my angels were untouched, and Tommy G's still had that wicked red stain on its head. What do you think it is?" Suzanne asked. I think we better leave," I said. The return trip through the woods was just as eerily silent as the first had been. Now and then, one of us would snap a twig hidden somewhere under the snow, but even the wind was mute as we trekked towards home. Neither of us could think of anything to say. When we got back, Franco was waiting for us on my porch. He was staring at the ground. When he heard us coming, he looked up with an expression that read nothing but pain. "It's Reggie," he said. Here's the account of Reggie's death the way I heard it. His parents were out drinking that Friday night and left him home with his 2 cousins. His cousins were 17 and 16. The winter had given them all cabin fever, and so they decided to roam around Reggie's complex. There's a big man-made lake out behind Reggie's apartment, and it had been frozen over for weeks. They were a band of reckless kids and decided to see if they could walk out to the middle of it. The oldest cousin was up front, then the younger one, and Reggie trailed along a few yards behind. Reggie's cousins are big, not just tall, but heavy too. They must have both had 100 pounds on Reggie. But it wasn't the largest one who was leading the column towards the center of the lake. It wasn't the younger one who was shuffling along a couple steps behind. It was Reggie, the young one, the skinny one, whose weight broke through the icy surface of the water. His cousins say they heard the loud snap of the shattering surface, but by the time they turned around, Reggie had vanished. Where he stood was a jagged hole clogged with chunks of ice. There wasn't any thrashing or screams for help. Reggie was there, then he was gone. They swept the snow away with their gloves to see if they could spot him struggling down below, but there was nothing in the murky black. The oldest cousin thrust his arm down into the hole, up to the shoulder, and fished all around, but there was nothing to pull up. The police brought in a diving team, and they plunged down into the hole one after another. When they pulled Reggie up a half an hour later, the skin was completely blue, and his arms were frozen stiff around his chest. Part 3. Franco was sick to his stomach when Suzanne and I told him about the snow angels. about the brief apparitions that both of us had seen just before Tommy G and Reggie died. He traversed the whole spectrum of emotions, anger that we had kept it secret, unabashed sobbing when the guilt of his taking part in the ritual surfaced, and then terror that his own snow angel laid right next to Reggie's. At that revelation, something in him broke and he began to laugh. We thought he was crying again at first, but then he tossed back his head and guffawed and slapped his knee and sighed in a relieved way. Franco didn't have a death wish. Something had gone wrong in his head, and we should have been more proactive because Suzanne and I both knew it. Franco was the kind of kid that always had things go his way. His parents spoiled the hell out of him. He was handsome and charming and was graced with beautiful blue eyes. He was a teenage heartthrob just a few years short of blooming, and now, suddenly, he was just the next in line. Some time passed, a couple weeks. We were in the first days of March, and while it hadn't snowed much, freezing temperatures kept the grounds covered. We hadn't been back to the clearing since Reggie fell through the ice. I couldn't stomach to see the red stain on the head of Tommy G's snow angel or the 2-inch sheet of ice pooled up in Reggie's. What none of us said, though, was the real reason we were avoiding the clearing. No one wanted to see if there was something on Franco's. We just ignored it. The three of us tried to go through the motions at school, but even school had become a grim place. 2 students died in the blink of an eye. The teachers carried on as if everything was normal, but their heart wasn't in it. The students still chatted and joked and passed notes, but even our laughter was the guilty, hollow kind. Everyone treated Franco, Suzanne, and I different. We could do no wrong. There were offers of assistance for every mundane task we came across. I caught people's glances in the cafeteria when the 3 of us sat together. None of us eating much, none of us talking much. Franco was especially quiet. He just sat doodling most of the time, and none of the teachers said anything about it. He didn't turn in homework. He half-heartedly scribbled answers on exams. Franco was a different person. There was Franco in the hallway with mismatching shoes. There was Franco in the cafeteria flooding his lunch tray with ranch because he forgot to let off the pump. There was Franco sitting in his front yard, jamming a stick into the mud. I felt bad for him. One day I pulled Suzanne aside and told her we had to do something. Sure, we were still pretty messed up about Tommy G and Reggie too, but Franco was facing something we couldn't understand. Maybe we were just making assumptions about the nature of this ritual we botched, but empirical evidence suggested that our punishment was moving in a definite order, and in that order, Franco's death was the next stepping stone. We showed up to his house with a cake. Yes, this was the best that our preteen brainstorming could come up with. Surely, we thought, some fucking sweets would turn things around. His parents ushered us into the house, smiling hard because they worried about what their son had become and were glad to have help from his friends. We found Franco in his room, just sitting there. No music turned on, no magazine in front of him. He conducted himself as if he were in death's waiting room. We circled around him, then joined him on the floor, setting the cake in front of him. Franco just sort of nodded, then returned his gaze to the wall. Franco's parents had given us some paper plates and some plastic forks, and Suzanne held the knife out to Franco and asked if he wanted to cut the cake, and at the sight of it, Franco lunged like a cat against the wall. He tripped over half of his belongings, scrambling around the room. I shot my hand out to Suzanne and pushed the knife down to the carpet. Franco was nearly hyperventilating. We just stared. It was quiet like that for a minute or two. Then all 3 of us laughed. And we laughed hard. Franco got the best chuckle of us all and cracked jokes at his own expense, pretending to claw his way up the wall, making hissing sounds. It seemed like everything was back to normal. But then Franco started talking about some weird thing lemurs did that he read about in National Geographic, and he stopped mid-sentence because Suzanne was staring at him with her eyes as wide as headlights and her lower lip quivering, and I looked up where she was looking and saw it. Something between a cloud of vapors and a woman was kneeling behind Franco. There was no face to make out or clothes that I can describe. It was just as if a human had been painted in those squiggly lines you see in the air above hot pavement on a summer day. Franco was asking us what our deal was when the spirit unfurled a pair of wings the width of a truck from behind her back and hugged her ethereal arms around Franco's shoulders. Franco said we were giving him goosebumps all of a sudden. "Franco," Suzanne whimpered. "It's here." Guardian angels are a legend that says when people are in trouble, divine spirits will intervene on their behalf. It was supposed to be a sign that a person's time hadn't yet come. The ritual with the snake and the pentagram and the candles and the incantations, that was supposed to let us see guardian angels. But we were seeing them all wrong. The spirits, these wisps, these mirages, they weren't guarding anybody. They were announcing death. No, worse yet, they were setting death in motion. Would Tommy G have been in that car crash if there was no ritual? Would Reggie have fallen through the ice if no one had lopped off Sissy's head? If we weren't such gullible and reckless children, would Suzanne and I have seen Franco innocently shivering in this evil spirit's embrace? Franco was in bad shape. He was shaking like a leaf in a tree. He was pale. He was fighting back tears, and he kicked the cake across his room, and he took the knife we were using to cut the cake, and he threw it out the window. Franco marched into the bathroom down the hall. From behind the locked door, he gave us instructions. We had to go to the clearing and see what had become of his snow angel. He was just too scared to join us. It was safer if he just locked himself up in the bathroom and did nothing, not a single thing. He was sobbing so hard we could barely make out the words. Now and then, he would lash out with screaming and cursing and beat his fists against the counters. Suzanne and I left in a hurry, not bothering to tell his parents what was going on. Franco's house was the furthest of all of us from the clearing. I grabbed Suzanne by the elbow, and the two of us jogged our way towards the woods. Twice, Suzanne collapsed mid-step and sat shivering on the pavement. I wiped the tears from her eyes. I told her we didn't have time to cry yet. It took us 15 minutes to get to the entrance of the woods. It took another 10 to find the clearing. And when we did, there lay Franco's snow angel, the third in line. And it was a sickening sight. A pile of brackish green bile was freezing in the center of the snow angel. Neither of us could tell what this ugly goop was, but it gave off a putrid chemical smell, and there were little powdery chunks of something mixed in it. I got a stick and churned up the slimy puddle. It was stringy and sticky like mucus. When I disturbed it, the god-awful smell became overpowering. Suzanne and I had to walk away and collapse in the snow to catch our breath. "What is it?" Suzanne pleaded. "What does it mean?" "I don't know," I yelled. I was furious. "Is Franco going to die?" Suzanne asked, her voice crackling. I beat my fists into the snow and began to rock back and forth on my knees. A headache pounded inside my skull. "I don't know," I said. I grit my teeth and scrunched up my face and groaned, as if terror were a physical wound stinging in my chest. "I don't know." What Suzanne and I did know was that we really didn't know anything. In the realest sense of the cliché, we were messing with forces we did not understand. What good did it do for the two of us to come to the clearing? What good would it do to know that Franco's death was imminent when we didn't know how or why or when it was coming? We must have sat there in the clearing for 20 minutes, each of us just silent with our thoughts. After a while, I pulled Suzanne up to her feet. "We've got to go tell him," I said. "Would you want to be told?" Suzanne asked. "I don't know." We didn't get a chance either way. By the time we got back to the house, Franco was being loaded into the back of an ambulance. His dad hugged his arms around Franco's wailing mother. She looked up at us with tears running all over her red face, but didn't say anything before they climbed into the ambulance with their son. Turns out, Franco couldn't handle the potential of his own death, and he took matters into his own hands. He was locked up in the bathroom, and shortly after we left for the clearing, Franco just started swallowing down whatever cleaners and solvents and pills he could find in the cabinets. His dad kicked down the door when Franco didn't respond and found him on the floor surrounded in empty bottles of Drano and sleeping pills and toilet bowl cleaner. At the hospital, they pumped his stomach, but it didn't help. He was in a coma for a couple of hours, and then all his organs failed in a hurry. Just like Tommy G and Reggie, he was there 1 minute, and then he was gone. Suzanne broke down and told her parents everything. Then all hell broke loose in our little town. The local papers printed headlines about 5 teenagers performing black magic and sacrifice in the woods. The nightly news instructed parents on how to spot signs of Satan worship. I was ostracized at school when I eventually returned to classes. No one sat with me at lunch or spoke to me in the halls. The teachers regarded me like an ugly stain in their classrooms. Suzanne was pulled out of school and sent to live with her grandparents in New England. I never got a chance to say goodbye to her between Franco's death and her departure. I watched from my bedroom window as her family's SUV, packed to the brim with luggage, pulled out of the driveway and sped off to the airport. I was grounded indefinitely, but that was fine, because I had nowhere to go. My friends were all dead. No one in town would acknowledge me. On grocery trips, I would follow at my parents' heels, trying to ignore all the people staring at me from down the aisles. I heard that Suzanne was in therapy, and I was glad, because that meant she was alive and the spirit hadn't checked off the next name on its list. My parents eschewed the need for a psychiatrist and took me straight to a priest instead. He pried for details of the ritual and everything that happened after. He prayed with me for hours. It was funny to me because even after explaining what happened to Tommy G and Reggie and Franco, no one actually believed it was black magic or spirits that had brought about their death. Tommy G and Reggie were victims of accidents, they said, and Franco had killed himself because he was frightened and depressed and didn't know better. Strange that no one actually believed in the ritual's power, but I was still punished as if it were our fault. It was early April by the time I was finally able to leave the house on my own again. Even then, I had to check in with my parents every half hour and provide a detailed itinerary of everything I was up to. Spring was just around the corner, and the snow was melting everywhere that received steady sunlight. I got an email from Suzanne late one night. She was coming home to visit her parents for the weekend. She wasn't allowed to see me, but she wanted to sneak out anyway so that we could talk. She said she was doing well and that therapy was helping her cope. She hadn't seen any more spirits. She had spent those first weeks after Franco's passing terrified that her own death was hiding in every shadow, but when it didn't come, her fear began to fade. She seemed optimistic in her email. That made me feel better too. She asked me to go to the clearing again and see if our snow angels had melted. If they were gone, she wrote, then she could finally feel safe. I didn't tell my parents about the email, but Suzanne's parents must have tipped them off because they kept a tight leash on me all that week. Once again, I was confined to the house, and my desire to return to that clearing one last time burned like a raging fire in my gut. Finally, the day of Suzanne's flight, I managed to persuade my parents to let me walk to the dollar store. I told them I had a project for school and needed to grab a few craft supplies. I would go straight there and hurry back, I promised, and they agreed. The neighborhood was wet and bleak with only a few piles of dirty snow still lining the streets. As soon as I was out of sight of my house, I headed for the woods. Buds were forming in the branches and the sound of birds and barking squirrels had returned. The ground was black with mud as I walked among the trees. Now and then I stopped to look towards the sky, where, somewhere inside those billowing gray clouds, Suzanne was barreling across the world on a commercial airliner. I smiled. Seeing Suzanne after so long would give me the first inkling of closure that I needed. I was sure of it. In the clearing, the shade of the trees had preserved a patchy blanket of snow. The pentagram had melted away. Sissy's dried-up brown blood had faded into the stump. A long tract of snow remained where our snow angels had been made on that terrible Friday, but the snow angels themselves had melted away, and I could only make out a rough outline of them composed of mud and standing water. I stood at the foot of Suzanne's snow angel and stared up at the sky in hopes that I would catch a glimpse of her plane flying by, and I took a deep breath before kneeling down to check the snow angel for any blemishes. There was no blood, no bile, No ice. Nothing. I let out a sigh of relief. I closed my eyes tight and smiled. It was over. I opened my eyes. Then, thump. Like a hammer from the sky, a blackbird plummeted out of thin air and slammed into the ground, right where Suzanne's snow angel had laid.
The Proposition by Mike Waldrep. Narrated by Todd Farrell. Featuring Melissa Exelberth and SungWon Cho. Yet another grim day started with the alarm clock blaring maddeningly. The day itself wasn't the issue, or even the morning alarm. More specifically, Kathy dreaded facing her husband, Marty. Their marriage, once brilliant with the colors of life, now dwindled into grays.
Instead of giving a politician the keys to the city, it might be better to change the locks. Did you hear me, Kathy? Kathy, did you hear me? Kathy!
What is it you want?
14 long years of marriage to this man had been like a stent in purgatory. Marty's consistency and predictability, once a source of comfort, now pained Kathy. His haircut, the same haircut that he has had since he was 16, irked her.
You are a man. Get a grown-up's haircut, idiot.
Of course, she never spoke this aloud, but her internal dialogue provided the soundtrack. Every morning was filled with the same tired jokes.
Is this coffee or is this mud? It looks like...
Blah, blah, blah.
Even his boyish smile, wide and toothy, infuriated her.
What the hell are you so happy about?
She wore a porcelain smile, choking back the urge to strangle him. He never complained or argued. Even when she tried to goad him into an argument, he kept the same calm demeanor.
Show some emotion, you robot!
She screamed in her head. Marty worked as an accountant. He was smart, Jeopardy smart. While they watched evening game shows, Marty would answer the questions a split second before the contestants.
Who was I? When we left, Tony had control of the board. Tony, your category? U.S. presidents. Here's your clue. I was assassinated in September of 1901. Who was I?
William McKinley.
Who was Martin Van Buren? Sorry, Tony. The correct answer was, who is William McKinley?
He wasn't always correct, but he usually was.
Why don't you go on one of those shows and win us some money?
Kathy often asked. He always brushed the notion aside, saying he wasn't that smart, stating,
Anyone could answer these questions.
Kathy couldn't. She found his modesty dishonest.
He knows he is smart.
She complained internally.
He's just fishing for compliments.
At this point in her life, Kathy couldn't stomach anything about her husband. Even the way he drank his coffee grinded on her nerves. She was sick of how he talked, sick of how he smelled. Kathy was sick of him altogether. Her only morning rest came after Marty left for work. Kathy would have 60 minutes of alone time before she had to leave to work herself.
Goodbye, hon. See you later.
The front door shut as Marty left, and Kathy exhaled deeply in relief. This morning, she decided to catch up on some light reading while enjoying some green tea. Well, she tried to enjoy it. Kathy didn't care for tea, but she read it was one of the only healthy things to drink besides water. The doorbell rang out.
Oh no, that idiot came back. He must have forgotten his house key again. Why he insists on keeping it separate from his car keys, I will never know.
She slumped out of the puffy recliner and lumbered to the front door, expecting her dull husband. However, on the other side of the door stood a thin man in a dark blue suit and matching fedora. He looked like he had come straight out of a Humphrey Bogart movie or something. His pencil-thin mustache danced on his upper lip as he spoke.
"Hello, madam. I am hoping you can spare a moment to hear my proposition."
Normally, the door would be closed before a door-to-door salesman's first sentence was out, but Kathy was caught off guard. Kathy composed herself for a moment.
"I am not sure what you want, but I am not buying anything."
She spoke her well-rehearsed line. Besides the salespeople and the religious zealots, she typically had to fend off charity workers and Girl Scouts. Those damn cookies go straight to her thighs.
"My good madam, I have no intentions of selling you anything. Now, I will be quick, as I know you have to get to work."
He smiled at her with a wink. The man brushed her aside as he strolled into her living room.
"Wait, who said you could? Hey, how did you know I had to?"
Kathy stopped talking. She couldn't finish her sentence. She was flabbergasted. Yes, she was flabbergasted at the gall of this man. The man sat in her recliner and sipped her tea.
"Nasty stuff, this tea. Is health really worth it?"
He laughed.
"Please sit, Mrs. Miller. We have much to discuss."
"Who do you think you are?"
Kathy dashed over to her kitchen counter to pick up her cell phone to call the police. Where did her phone go? She left it charging this morning on the kitchen counter. A whistle rang out from the living room, where her uninvited guest waved her cell phone back and forth between his thumb and index finger.
"Mrs. Miller, please. I would like to get down to business."
How?
Confusion caused her head to hurt. Could this really be happening?
"How? That is easy. 'Tis but a little sleight of hand, a little hocus-pocus."
The man shook his hand, and the phone disappeared.
"Mrs. Miller, if you would like me to leave, just ask."
"Please leave,"
she scowled as she pointed to the front door.
"and give me back my phone."
He let out a sigh.
All right. All right. Although it is a shame we didn't talk about your husband's unfortunate accident."
He rose from the puffy chair and turned to the door.
Wait.
Kathy didn't realize she said the words until they slipped by her lips. Did she really want to talk to this man? She then noticed his eyes. Something was wrong about them. He had no irises, just pupils swimming on white globes. And she could swear for a brief moment his teeth were all filed to points. So many things seemed wrong with this man. Although she doubted man was the right term. Every fiber of her being told her this creature was no man, and to run. But deep down, she knew she had to hear what it had to say. She just had to know. He grinned as if hearing her innermost thoughts, and spun on his heels to face her.
"Now we're being civilized. Shall we sit?"
He gestured toward the couch.
"Oh, and your phone is in your front pocket."
He gave a nonchalant wave towards Kathy. She felt the outside of her pocket, and her fingers slid over the outline of her phone. It hadn't been there a moment before. Kathy sat on the edge of the couch, her hands cupped on her lap. Relaxing was not an option.
"You may call me Mr. Sticks."
He reached over to the end table and picked up a framed picture of Marty and Kathy.
"What a fine-looking couple you make."
His grin widened. Kathy could feel the warmth of her cheeks as her anger rose.
"What is it you want, Mr. Sticks?"
"It is not what I want, but what you want."
He set the picture back on the end table and straightened it a couple of times until it was exactly where he first found it. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped off his hands as if he had just touched something distasteful.
"You have a relationship problem. I'm offering a cure. I am offering to end your marriage without any messy divorce or splitting of the assets. In fact, with the insurance policy you already have on your husband, you can live comfortably for the rest of your life."
He leaned forward with his hands together.
"Sound interesting to you, Mrs. Miller?"
She regarded his face for a moment. His face was narrow, with high cheekbones and a pointy nose. He seemed almost cartoonish.
How do you know I have relationship issues?
Good madam, knowing things is my business. Like when you were 8 and let the neighbor boys see up your skirt. Quite the exhibitionist.
He winked at her from across the room.
Are you the devil?
Her eyes widened.
Why, madam, you flatter me.
His voice had a delighted tone.
I assure you I am not, but I do represent him. The boss can't be expected to handle every matter that comes across his desk.
Why are you here? And why me?
Her voice was shaking.
To help you, of course.
He tried to sound reassuring.
You know another client of ours, so while I was in the area, I wanted to offer our services to you as well.
But I don't know anyone whose spouse was killed.
Exactly the point.
He interrupted.
We wouldn't be any good if everyone knew about it.
Mr. Sticks regarded the overwhelmed look on Kathy's face for a moment before speaking.
Let me cut to the chase, so to speak. We are offering to kill your husband and end this travesty you call a marriage. You, my dear, get the freedom you desire.
Kathy contemplated. But why was she contemplating this? Was life really that bad? No, she couldn't continue. She had to do something. Why not just leave? Why not divorce him? She loved the house. She couldn't leave it.
Was it really this easy?
Yes, it is,
he said, interrupting her thoughts again.
You can choose to not accept my proposition, Mrs. Miller. You are under no obligation. However, perhaps I should show you your future, should you decide to pass on my offer.
He closed his eyes and raised a hand. A moment later, the vision started. There was a flash of light, and Kathy woke in a large movie theater sitting next to Mr. Sticks. He munched on popcorn, looking up at the screen. Kathy began to ask what was happening, but Mr. Sticks shushed her and pointed to the screen. She moved down a couple of seats away from him. Being that close to him unnerved her. He chuckled to himself, for this was not the first person to squirm in his presence. He rather liked it. An image of the outside of her house flickered on the screen. The camera panned and zoomed in on the front door, which swung open, as if the camera itself had opened it. Images of the living room flowed by, stopping on Marty. He stood there in a familiar blue suit. He was older, but wore the same stupid smile. His hair had more gray than brown, but besides that, he looked the same. He walked out the front door, heading off to work.
Some things never change.
Mr. Sticks laughed. The camera panned to the bedroom.
Oh, here comes the good part.
His grin made munching popcorn a little difficult, but he managed. On the screen, sitting on the bed, a haggard Kathy stared at her feet, her hands rubbing over her lap. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she began to sob.
You never leave.
His voice actually sounded sympathetic.
You still complained and talked about leaving, but year after year, no divorce, no leaving, and no freedom.
Kathy felt tears rolling down her cheeks. She looked so old on the screen compared to how Marty had looked. Her heart sank.
And then there's this.
Again, Mr. Sticks pointed at the screen. Kathy glanced at Mr. Sticks and then looked back up at the screen to see her older self pick up the object from her lap. What was that? In horror, Kathy watched her older form fall limp. Blood sprayed against the walls. All breath left her lungs. Panic struck her, and she began looking around for an exit. The theater spun. Her eyes could no longer focus. She needed to escape. Mr. Sticks snapped his fingers, and they were back in the living room. Kathy felt her head, making sure she didn't have any new holes. She glared at Mr. Sticks.
You bastard! How could you?
That is the future you create, not me. I am your only option to avoid that unfortunate fate.
He tried to look sympathetic, but that emotion was lost on him again.
So if I decide to accept your offer, I will avoid that future?
You mean you won't swallow a gun barrel? That I can promise.
What do you want? Why help me?
The fight had been taken out of her. She couldn't end up living the life she had seen on the screen.
The cost. It always comes down to that, doesn't it?
Mr. Sticks crossed his legs and folded his hands in his lap.
The price is your soul.
He tapped his 2 index fingers together, awaiting a response.
You want my soul? I can't do that.
You are not one of those religious sorts, are you?
Mr. Sticks rolled his eyes.
You humans have the whole idea wrong. This is a game, a bet between 2 rivals. Just because you win a hand of poker doesn't mean you keep the cards, does it?
He opened his folded hands in a sign of trust.
Your soul isn't really yours to lose. It is just a tally on a scorecard for bragging rights between 2 immortals.
Kathy was at a loss.
All of existence is a bet?
Mind-blowing, I know. Believe it or not, we all work for the same team. Besides, what choice do you have?
She took a deep breath and nodded her head.
How do we do this?
A great relief came over her. There was light at the end of the tunnel, and she could smell her freedom.
Here is your contract.
He pulled out a scroll from inside his coat pocket.
I know the scroll is a little old school, but we got them in bulk in the Dark Ages. Besides, why not stick with the classic?
He handed the scroll to her.
To sign, just stick your finger at the bottom.
Kathy pressed her finger on the bottom of the scroll. A red dot formed beneath her finger and began to spread. She quickly pulled her finger away and noticed blood coming from the tip.
Now, that wasn't so bad.
Mr. Sticks rose from the chair.
Anyone can fake a signature. That's why we require blood.
He reached over and snatched the scroll from her hands.
I will take that. Now, let me give you a receipt.
Receipt? Why not?
Kathy was far beyond puzzled at this point, so she just decided to go with it.
Of course, many people tend to pass this offer off as a dream, so we offer a reminder so they won't forget.
You're not going to brand me or something like that, are you?
Her voice shook.
What?
He sounded truly surprised by her query.
Madam, we are not animals. Of course you will receive a paper receipt.
He pulled out a small square of paper, the same parchment as the scroll.
One final question, Mrs. Miller. His end. Should he suffer?
He tapped a pen against the small piece of paper.
On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being skinned alive with a butter knife, and 1 being sudden heart attack. Of course, these are just examples. Each death is customized for the individual.
Kathy paused to think, but Marty's face appeared in her mind. That smug smile.
Let's go with a 3.
She didn't want to be cruel, after all. 3 seemed like a reasonable number. Mr. Sticks scribbled 3 vertical lines which crossed at a point a quarter of their length. He circled the intersection, making it look like a crudely drawn bunch of wheat.
Don't judge the artwork. We wouldn't want everything spelled out. No need for evidence to be found just laying around.
He slyly smiled and handed the receipt to her.
This matter should be resolved for you in the next month, give or take a few days. We like to leave it as a little bit of a surprise. In the meantime, live as you normally would. Now you have a good day, Miss Miller. I imagine you and I will not speak again regarding this arrangement.
And with a wink, he was gone. No need for pretense any longer. Using the door was no longer necessary. Kathy decided to fake a headache that day and phoned in sick to work. A long bath was in order with her favorite candles. Over the next week, Kathy didn't reflect much on what was to come. As Mr. Sticks said, she recalled it as more of a vague dream, figment of her imagination. The receipt was the only reminder of that day, a marker declaring the reality of her decision. On day 8, the guilt began. That morning, she pulled the receipt with the 3 lines out. The tan color, along with the heavy weight and unclean edges, made the paper feel hundreds of years old.
Did he deserve to suffer? Wouldn't a single line have been sufficient?
Kathy decided to make Marty's final days as pleasant as possible. She made his favorite meals and watched his stupid sci-fi shows. She could stomach this for a few more weeks. All the while, her porcelain smile never faded. On the evening of day 12, Marty decided to go to a poker game with some co-workers. It was unusual for him to go out on a weeknight, but he seemed excited to get out of the house. This gave Kathy some time to relax and maybe get some laundry done. Kathy began putting away her laundry. She noticed that one of Marty's socks had been mixed with her clothes. She opened his sock drawer to put away the stray. In the back corner of the drawer was a familiar piece of paper. She withdrew it from the drawer, recognizing the receipt. What was it doing in his drawer? She went to her jewelry box where she had originally kept the receipt, only to find it exactly where she had left it.
Then, what is this?
She wondered. She unfolded the parchment. Sure enough, it was a receipt, with scribbles and marks similar to her own. At that precise moment, a voice from over her left shoulder whispered in her ear.
I see you found Marty's receipt.
Kathy clutched her fist to her chest, but dared not turn around. She knew who was behind her. Gone were the blue suit and pencil mustache. Behind Kathy stood what was once Mr. Styx. A vision of his skeletal body wrapped tightly with brittle, dry skin, exposed bones, and fiery eyes. She dared not turn and face him. The vision told her as much.
You see, Marty sought me out weeks before you and I met.
She felt Mr. Styx's bony fingers on both of her shoulders, his long nails sharpened to jagged points.
Tough luck. He opted for 5 lines. Don't worry, my dear. I will honor my side of the agreement and pay Marty a visit soon enough.
She could hear the crackling of his skin as he smiled.
A deal is a deal. Now shall we begin?
His bony fingers dug into her shoulders.
It is all right to scream.
Memories of New Year's. Written by Malcolm Teller. Performed by David Tyson. Featuring Brindolyn McNair, Eden, and Luke Fischer.
New Year's Day was always a special time in my life, both for what it represented and because of who I spent it with. Back then, and even until recently, I had no idea how horrifically dark it would turn later in my life. Now, I grew up, well, you could call it a chaotic environment. My parents were alcoholics, and there was barely ever any food in the house, owing to my mom and dad spending most of their paychecks on booze. That and my pops was always beating the tar out of me. I'd show up to school with a black eye and all the kids would point and whisper. The teachers would act super nice and friendly to me on account of it, but no one, not the kids, not their parents, and not the teachers would actually step in and do anything about it. It was one of those towns where everyone knew each other and saw each other as good people, even while it was obvious some were beating their kids. Enter my 3 friends, Rachel, Jenny, and Ryan. Their stories were similar to mine. Ryan's parents were neglectful and verbally abusive. Rachel's parents were practically the same as mine, and Jenny, well, how do I put this? Jenny's dad liked to go into her room at night. A lot. By the time she was 13, Jenny was in foster care and her dad was spending the first of many years in the state pen. It was almost like fate, somewhat poetic, that we all found each other. It started on a camping trip through our school. when we were assigned to the same squad. I noticed this kid, big glasses, straw-like hair shooting all over the place, getting shoved to the ground over and over by Rodney Finchley. Rodney was a major league loser until the day he got shot and killed in a drug deal gone wrong at age 17. The kid with the glasses kept trying to get up, and Rodney kept shoving him down and laughing with his friends like this was the funniest thing they'd ever seen.
Why do you keep getting up? Just stay down!
While I watched, out of nowhere, I started getting really, really angry. Years later, I realized I reacted the way I did because that SOB Rodney reminded me of my dad. So I marched over to him. Before I even knew what was happening, I had gave him a bloody nose. Long story short, Rodney and his gang of freaks steered clear of me and Ryan from then on. Later that day, Ryan introduced me to the rest of what would become our squad. There was Jenny, this girl with bright blonde hair and wide, inquisitive eyes. She was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. There was Rachel, this incredibly gifted, socially conscious Asian girl with braces and dark eyes. And finally, there was Ryan himself, with the biggest heart ever. From that day on, and throughout the 6th grade, we shared our stories with one another and bonded over them. Eventually, the 4 of us became inseparable. We would have done anything for each other. When we were 15, for example, Jenny and Rachel spent all night helping Ryan write a love poem to his crush just in time for Valentine's Day. When we were 16, Jenny's boyfriend cheated on her with a head cheerleader. So Rachel and I smashed in the windows of his car. But New Year's Day was something else entirely. By the time we were 12, we'd gotten into this habit of celebrating New Year's Day down at the lake in the center of the woods, on the outskirts of town. We'd go down there and play games, having make-believe adventures and battles. Our childish minds took us to far-off galaxies, primeval forests, and ancient cities below the waves, where we met the frightening, inspiring gods of those imaginary worlds. All of it brought to life by a shared agreement between our group of 4. The most interesting and intriguing thing that we made up and agreed on, however, was the mythos. It was our way of coping with what we were all going through at the time. The mythos are the rules. It was the religion, the spirituality that we agreed to live by, summed up in 10 simple words. The year we created the mythos, after a day of exploring the farthest reaches of our imagination, we stood together at the water's edge and welcomed the new year with these words. Every action has a reaction, and every call a response. Those were the words we said that year and every year after, in that spot with the waves of that nameless lake lapping in time with them. I don't remember who came up with them that first year or even why, but they and their meaning are something I've thought about a lot recently. It wasn't always just us, either. After that first year, the state finally became aware of Jenny's situation and did what needed to be done. They placed her in foster care and she transferred to a different district. From then on, she'd bring kids from her school over to celebrate with us. It was incredible showing someone new the world we'd built together and the words that strung them together. It would always end at the water's edge. Together, we'd repeat the familiar words. Every action has a reaction, and every call a response. Afterwards, everyone outside our group would go on their way and it'd just be us 4 again. Things went on like that for years, gradually tapering off as things got better for us. By the time I was 17, Jenny had been adopted by her foster parents, an excellent pair of people. doctors at the local hospital, and after hearing about my situation, they'd insist that I move in with them too. My parents put up no resistance to me moving out, and just like that, I found my life transformed. All it took was having a safe, quiet place to call home. The year before that, it had been Ryan. He'd moved in with an older cousin who had moved into town practically out of the blue. 2 years prior, Rachel had moved in with her older sister, Kim. Once she'd gotten out from under her parents' thumb, Kim had sworn she'd never come back and moved away. After receiving a couple of emails from her little sister, however, she changed her mind and moved back in town in order to provide a better environment for Rachel. In the end, we all finally had a place to hang our hats and people that cared. Even so, the 4 of us remained a family. Fast forward to present times, a couple of days before New Year's Day, mere months away from graduating high school. We all wondered what we were going to do. It was all we talked about when we went over to Jenny's house to have dinner together. Just the 4 of us, as her parents were away at a medical conference in England. Jenny and I were setting up and dressed to the nine.
Jake, would you get that?
Sure thing.
I swung the door open and smiled as I saw Ryan and Rachel.
Buddy!
Ryan embraced me in a bear hug as Rachel leaned over to give me a peck on the cheek.
So, Rye, you still committed to being an actor?
Jenny smirked. She tried to saw a chunk of meat off the chicken at the center of the table. Ryan had found out the same year we'd start hanging out together that he had a real passion for theater. All his sensitivity and flair, all the qualities that years ago made him a target for trolls like Rodney, had made it possible for him to flourish in the field of drama. His friendship with us and his delight at being on stage were the 2 biggest positives in his life. Ryan shrugged before popping a morsel of chicken into his mouth.
You see,
Stop talking with your mouth full.
I just think I'm suited for it, you know? It's what I'm meant to do.
Meant to do by what? Fate? The gods?
Oh, God. Remember that stuff we used to do at the lake every New Year's Day?
My eyes shot open wide. Yeah, the games we used to play. Oh, God. What we used to do?
Jenny would drink some of the water from the lake. A real solemn affair, if you ask me. But I can't for the life of me remember the rest.
I remember. The mythos, right? Every action has a reaction and every call a response.
Oh, wow. We took that so seriously back then.
We had such good times, didn't we?
Rachel nodded quickly.
We did, and now you're off to be an actor. I'm off to Harvard, hopefully, and Jenny's off to med school. Well, eventually.
I think something needs to be said, and everyone quieted to listen. I think no matter where we go or what we do, we should always remember that this, right here, all of us, this is what matters most. We've been through so much, and we'll always be together. All of us, no matter where we are, we're family, and that'll never change. Ryan raised his glass, and everyone else followed suit.
Hear, hear.
To friendship.
To family.
After we downed our drinks, we continued chattering away for a while. A short time later, the food was gone. We were full, and it was time for bed. We all retired to our rooms and drifted off to sleep, but not for long. I was startled awake by ragged screaming coming from the bathroom down the hall. I jumped out of bed and ran. By the time I made it to the door, Ryan and Rachel were there too. Together, we burst into the bathroom and found the floor covered with clear, watery vomit and Jenny in the middle of it all, hunched over the toilet. The water in the bowl was dark red, the rim splashed and streaked in crimson. Jenny looked up at us with tears in her eyes, a look of agony on her face as we entered the room. We all stood there, frozen in shock and horror, staring at Jenny's blood-covered jaw. As she retched more, my mind started to race. Was it food poisoning? No, I rationalized. It couldn't be. None of the rest of us were sick, and we'd all eaten the same food. As I stood thinking, Jenny vomited again and leaned back, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. Rachel knelt down and wrapped her arms around her, stroking her hair in an attempt to comfort her. Ryan ran downstairs to call 911. Jenny ended up in the hospital. Once she'd been admitted, we notified her parents, who tried to get on the first flight back home. Unfortunately, due to a variety of setbacks, their flights kept getting delayed and it was some time before they arrived. In the meantime, the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with Jenny. After observing her overnight and in spite of our protests, they advised us there was nothing further they could do, and so they released her, advising us to monitor her and telling her to return to the emergency department if there were any further incidents. Jenny decided to stay at Rachel's. As for me, I headed home and tried to get some sleep. For some reason, however, my mind kept drifting back to the lake, to the celebrations we'd have on those New Year's Day evenings. I fell into a restless sleep and woke exhausted in the morning. Unsure what to do, I called Ryan, who by then had returned home. Ryan, I'm kind of messed up in the head over last night. Can I come over?
Oh, sure thing, buddy.
An hour later, I arrived at Ryan's place. He greeted me at the door, brought me into his room, and waved me over to a beanbag by his bed. Jenny vomiting like that really messed me up, right? Ryan looked over at me and nodded.
No, I feel you. It was really bizarre. But she's gonna be okay, at least, so that's good.
I don't know. I feel really shaken up over it. I don't know. I'm just being stupid, I guess.
I think it might help to talk about something else.
His eyes lit up.
Hey, do you think we should all go do a New Year's Day celebration tomorrow? The way we used to years ago.
I laughed and shook my head. Man, we grew out of that a long time ago. He smiled wistfully, as though reminiscing, and for a little bit, I smiled too, but I could feel a tension between us. Something odd and out of place, and it was growing. After an awkward silence, I said my goodbyes and took my leave. After returning home, I busied myself watching television and browsing the web. At around 10 p.m., I called it quits and headed to bed. I woke up sometime later to the sound of my phone ringing. I groggily reached over and answered it. Hello. It was Rachel. She could barely get her words out. Eventually, I understood what she was getting at, and it made my heart feel like it had dropped right out from under me. Rachel had found Jenny motionless in her upstairs bathroom, lying in a pool of bloody, watery vomit. There was no pulse. The next few hours were a blur. I remember clearly sitting on Rachel's couch, Ryan and I beside her, rubbing her back and trying to console her as the paramedics and police did their work. Hours later, the police and paramedics took off, leaving us with more questions than answers.
How could this even happen?
I paced back and forth. my mind racing. I threw my hands up, my eyes wide with confusion. Now I got nothing.
Look, maybe the autopsy will figure it out. In fact, it has to. It has to.
Abruptly, Rachel held a hand up dismissively.
You two need to go.
I immediately protested, but she wouldn't have it.
I need to be alone. Please. Please let me grieve.
Ryan and I made eye contact and then we both nodded at her. We left her place and headed to our respective homes. I had no idea the dark turn the next few hours would take and how they would change everything. I didn't sleep well that night. I dreamt I was standing by the lake on the evening of New Year's Day. Before me was Jenny in her usual gray hoodie and black jeans. I called out to her.
Jenny!
After a moment, she turned around. What I saw horrified me. Jenny's mouth and jaw were soaked in blood, so thick that it looked black. Ants and beetles raced out of her mouth and across her face. Her eyes shone like headlights. Ah! I woke up, thrashing in bed, heart pounding as I glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Realizing I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, I called Ryan. He didn't pick up, but I wasn't about to settle for that. Instead, I jumped up, got dressed, and headed out on foot. I was a few blocks from Ryan's house when I noticed the police cars and ambulances lining up along his street. My eyes shot open with fear and I took off running. I spotted a cop writing on a notepad and approached him. In a panic, I begged him to tell me what happened. Ryan had killed himself. He bled out in his bathtub. He must have done it almost immediately after I left. I could see the whole scene in my mind so perfectly. Ryan, still full of nostalgia, a smile plastered on his face, drawing the water and getting undressed. I imagine he smiled even as the razor dug in, even as the drops of blood hitting the water, year after year. Every call, a response. And I felt numb as I walked away from the scene. Not just because Ryan was dead, but because I finally knew. I ran myself ragged getting to Rachel's place. I got the spare key from underneath the doormat and let myself in. The air was still. Everything was quiet. My heart thumped in my chest as I desperately hoped for the best. It sank as I stepped into the living room and heard water running in the kitchen. There I'd found Rachel on the floor beside the sink, lying still in a pooling mixture of blood and water, staring at the ceiling with glassy, unblinking eyes. It appeared she had slipped and hit her head on the kitchen table. I'm at the lake now, and it's near midnight. I'm here because I need to be. This place is thick with memories, and I know my role. Jenny would say the initial prayer and then drink from the lake. Then Ryan made a small cut on his wrist and bled into the water, introducing life into the equation. Next, Ryan and Rachel would restrain the kid, the ones Jenny brought, whoever they were, and force their heads beneath the surface. They held them while they thrashed until they finally went still. Then we'd set the body adrift and let it float away. Jenny had always made sure to pick the ones that wouldn't be missed or cared for. and then I'd give the call. The beings we met during our New Year's games, in the places we traveled to in our minds, they weren't our imagination. Far from it. They were real, and they were ancient, and they were powerful. I'd call out to them, beseeching them to bless the year and our lives with the sacrifice made. We were certain they would answer, and they did. After all, every action has a reaction. Following the rituals, our lives improved dramatically. In exchange for our services, we were granted safety, success, and the ability to forget what we had done in order to get it. But now the response. Even as I speak, I see the waters rippling more and more, as if something is approaching. Every action has a reaction, and every call a response. Never forget, for every call, a response.
Chilling tales for dark nights.